Hey everybody, and welcome back to NeurosciQ. Today we're going to be discussing a trend that has taken the media by storm. This is called dopamine fasting. Dopamine fasting originated in Silicon Valley of San Francisco, California, and it was popularized by Dr. Cameron Sipa, a professor at UCSF and also an executive coach to VCs and CEOs from Silicon Valley. Today, we're going to be talking about what dopamine fasting is, and along with that, we're going to be debunking some of the myths that have been popularized by the media in terms of what it is. Along with that, we're going to talk about what it's used for, if it works, and of course, if it does, we're going to mention how it works. So stay tuned. The views of what dopamine fasting is are quite conflicted. A quick YouTube search will reveal influencers and YouTubers posting about how dopamine fasting changed their life. And if you watch one of those videos, you'll see that they basically just cut themselves off from everything. They'll spend a whole day without technology, without reading books, without social interactions, without exercise, and even without food. They just basically drink water and do nothing else but sit around and think all day. Well, this isn't exactly what dopamine fasting really is in clinical terms. The method that Dr. Cameron Sipa implements, he agrees, is a bit of a misnomer. You see, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is associated with motivation, but the media seems to think that dopamine is responsible for pleasure, when in reality, dopamine is just released to motivate you to do something. So for instance, if you walk by a pizza shop and you smell pizza cooking, dopamine is released in your brain to motivate you to go get pizza. It's not actually what causes the pleasure. But dopamine, because of this property, can be responsible for addictive behaviors. And so what Dr. Cameron Sipa's version of dopamine fasting is restricting addictive behaviors. You see, he noticed that in modern society, we're moving away from substance abuse disorders and more to behavioral disorders. So rather than having people who have addictions to cocaine, methamphetamines, or other illegal substances, psychiatrists are having to deal with more and more addictions to abnormal behaviors or detrimental behaviors. In fact, the DSM has recognized this and added things like internet addictions, gaming addictions, gambling and shopping addictions, and also addictions to emotional eating to their list of psychiatric disorders. In his own private practice, Dr. Cameron Sipa noted that part of the reason for these addictions is that all these things are just so accessible now. In fact, most of us have a phone in our back pocket, and so we can access online shopping, online gaming, online gambling, and a plethora of other things which we can become addicted to. Now, when does this become a problem? Well, the problem arises when the behavior becomes distressing to the individual, when it imposes on their social interactions and quality of work, and also when the behavior is something that they can't give up. So, in Dr. Cameron Sipa's version of dopamine fasting, which is the original version of dopamine fasting, what you actually do is try to reduce your addictive behaviors and control them so that they become manageable and they're not interfering with your life. Now, this doesn't mean cutting off access to the internet or social interactions or even exercise, which is quite ridiculous. It just means setting a schedule so that you can manage the time you spend and devote to a specific behavior. So, while media might be portraying dopamine fasting as cutting off all types of enjoyment and just spending a day doing nothing, what it really is just controlling behaviors, managing behaviors, so that you can improve your quality of life. And the methodologies used for a proper dopamine fast are actually evidence-based therapies that stem from cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. So what is CBT? CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, is an evidence-based therapy that helps addicts make connections between their thoughts, emotions, and actions so that they can promote recovery from their addiction. Now, there are two methods from CBT that are used in dopamine fasting. These methods are stimulus control and exposure and response prevention. So stimulus control is just removing the stimulus that is causing an issue. So for instance, if you're addicted to online shopping, that would be keeping your computer away from you, trying not to interact with online shopping websites. Exposure and response prevention is realizing when you have the urge to conduct your behavior and preventing it. So perhaps you're addicted to checking notifications on your phone, and the first thing that would happen is you would get an urge to check your phone. So rather than actually giving in to that urge and checking your phone, exposure and response prevention would require you to just feel the urge and wait till it dissipates. Now, with that being said, in terms of stimulus control, Dr. Cameron Sipa recognizes that we can't just get rid of the stimulus completely. For instance, a lot of people need their laptops to get their job done, especially in Silicon Valley. So rather than cutting out the stimulus completely, which isn't feasible in modern society, stimulus control with dopamine fasting involves creating a schedule and applying restrictions. So maybe that means restricting your access to certain websites rather than getting rid of your laptop altogether. Dopamine fasting is actually quite similar to intermittent fasting as well, which we discussed in another video. Instead of removing something completely, you actually just manage it by creating a schedule where you follow the guidelines and help reduce your time spent giving in to a behavior. Now let's talk a bit more about what these addictive behaviors are and how they come to be. Now, if you have some familiarity with classical conditioning, you will know that neutral stimuli can become conditioned stimuli and promote a response. The famous study with Pavlov's dogs showed that when dogs saw food, they naturally salivated. Now, if you pair that with the ringing of a bell, eventually the bell on its own will cause them to salivate. This is actually what happens when we get a notification on our phone. So we can have external stimuli promoting a response. That's the motivation to interact with our phone. Now, Dr. Cameron Sipa notes that behavioral addictions also have an added factor, and this factor makes them much more hard to deal with. That is, our internal stimuli. For instance, when you're sitting around doing nothing, you can have internal anxiety or boredom to just look at your phone or to do some sort of behavior that helps reduce that anxiety or boredom. And going back to the example of using a phone, this is the reason why lots of people just pick up their phone and look at it even if there was no notification, because there's an internal drive to do so. So with that, we have double reinforcement happening with behavioral addictions. We have positive reinforcement when the individual receives some sort of reward. So maybe if you're addicted to online shopping, your reward is that you purchase something online. But there's also the negative reinforcement, and that is removing the stimuli that was causing you distress. So maybe you're sitting around bored, you feel the boredom, but all of a sudden you go online and start shopping. Now you've removed the boredom and that feels better. So we have two types of reinforcement happening, positive and negative reinforcement, both promoting the development and the spiral of these addictive behaviors that are so prevalent in modern society. So now we get to the question of, can dopamine fasting help? And the answer is, for some people, yes. For others, it might not be ideal. Again, with all these sorts of problems, if you think you have a behavioral addiction, you should always go to a doctor and talk about it with them. Now, Dr. Cameron Sipa knows that not everybody has access to a doctor, and that's why he made dopamine fasting and he tried to popularize it. But he notes that if you don't think it's working for you, you shouldn't do it. And he also notes that the way that YouTube and media are describing dopamine fasting is not something he would recommend at all. Depriving yourself of food for a whole day, or even exercise or social interaction, is not something a medical practitioner would recommend. In fact, the way that dopamine fasting really works is just trying to curb your classical conditioning and promote habituation. So ways to do this could be by creating a schedule. Dr. Cameron Sipa recommends restricting the behavior. He says that the way to do it would be to first cut off the behavior 1 to 4 hours before bed. So during the week, whatever that behavior is, don't allow yourself to do it 1 to 4 hours before you're going to sleep. He also says that one day of the weekend should be spent without that behavior at all. So, if possible, if you can go without your phone or without technology or without whatever is promoting your behavioral addiction for the whole day, then do so. Then he says each quarter to go on a weekend getaway. Somewhere local, just get outside, interact with people, do something where you're not so focused on technology or your other behavioral addiction. And finally, he says it's good to take a vacation for at least a week each year, where you completely disconnect from that, where you're not worried about notifications, you're not feeling internal anxiety or stress, and trying to fill that void with some detrimental action, like online shopping or gambling. So with that schedule in mind, it's a lot like intermittent fasting. And in fact, he says that for people with emotional eating disorders, that intermittent fasting can be their solution. That could be their version of dopamine fasting. Now, if we want to get back to the whole idea about how dopamine's just for motivation and promoting the action of a behavior rather than pleasure, why did he call it dopamine fasting? The truth is, Dr. Cameron Sipa just used this term so that it could be catchy and so that he can help to get the word about his actual treatment out to people who are struggling with behavioral addictions. It may have backfired a little bit with the attention from the media that he's gotten, but if you actually look into the proper methods, it could really help and change your life. But dopamine fasting is nothing like what you might see portrayed in the majority of the media. You don't have to stop yourself from eating for the day, cut yourself off from the internet entirely, inhibit social interactions, not allow yourself to listen to music, and not exercise or not read books. In fact, Dr. Cameron Sipa states that you should encourage things like socializing. Pro-social behaviors are good for you. So don't take a day where you cut yourself off from humanity. Get outside, talk to people, do something other than engaging with the addictive behavior at hand. He recommends that during your fast, you should do things like exercise, take on a leadership role in your community, have conversations with people, learn from other people by listening, or learn from picking up a book and reading it. On top of that, you could also be creative, read, write, draw, dance, whatever it is. You don't need to deprive yourself from joy for a day so that you can feel better. The reality is that you have to limit the behavior that has been causing distress or impairing your work or social life. You've got to monitor that addictive behavior so that you can feel joy. So maybe try a dopamine fast. If you find that there's something in your life that kind of seems to be all-encompassing and taking over your day, try to limit that and do some of the other things that we mentioned. At the end of the day, it's helpful to break out of your normal routine and change things up a bit. We hope you enjoyed this video. That's all for today. I hope that I helped debunk some of the myths about dopamine fasting and helped you get to the bottom of what it really is. Hope you learned something new and you enjoyed this video, and the links to Dr. Cameron Sipa's outtake on what dopamine fasting is will be below. And if you want to see what dopamine fasting is through more of a media lens, you can just Google dopamine fasting and see what's out there. But hopefully this video helped to educate you on what dopamine fasting really is, so that you don't spend a whole day cutting yourself off from anything that gives you joy. Like I said, that's all for today's video. We hope to see you next week. Thanks for watching, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next week.